Belgium.
Belgium, Belgium,
In English.
In English, we do.
Yes.
Okay. Belgium, we are in the oven. That's the making of the artist. So it's really where I was shaped.
Yes.
And it seems to be more, I'm going to use a French word which you can help me translating, indélébile.
Ah oui.
Like, you know, it seems to be
You can't erase and you can't forget.
That is not that easy to get away from, or no matter. I left when I was quite young, I mean, in early 20s. I haven't really lived in Belgium since 1981, but I can recognize certain Belgian features, or more people recognize Belgian features in my practice, in my work, in particular in the graphic work, but also sometimes in like the general approach to things.
But why to leave Belgium after all?
Why did I leave Belgium? I left Belgium because Belgium is a quite narrow space and culture. So there's always a temptation to sort of, try it out elsewhere. The reason why I stayed abroad is more a series of chance encounters that made me arrive in Mexico in 1986 and somehow stay in Mexico later on. While I was switching from architecture practice to the visual arts, and Mexico seemed the perfect sort of laboratory to experiment, far away from my culture and far away from the eye of my peers, if you want. It was much more anonymous. There was no real contemporary art scene when I started. I sort of, my becoming an artist went along the making of the local art scene. So that it was a lucky coincidence with a moment in Mexico where something was starting to happen, and I was myself going through a deep change, if you want, and that's how Belgium went in the background.
Yes, everyday life
is both the sort of source of inspiration and main territory of intervention. I mean, I think a lot of my practices are very simple disruptions in everyday life to like evidentiate, put in evidence minor sort of events of that of some ongoing life. I mean, it's make people aware of the way certain mechanisms of everyday life unfold.
But why, after all, to be interested in everyday life?
Why? Because it's a way of being part of your society. It's a way of being sort of both actor and subject, if you want. Like this kind of melt into the social texture. I mean, I'm an immigrant. So I think a lot of the work I've done, especially in the early years, was all about trying to become a local. And I think the documentation of everyday life was one other layer of entering that social fabric. I think over time it became so much part of me that I'm less questioning it, but certainly in the first decade of my practice, it was all about becoming part of.
But a privileged immigrant.
Privilege in the sense that I can live, yeah.
And you choose this country.
I choose this country. This country chose me. It could be argued. I mean, I had no particular. I mean, talking about Mexico, I had no particular interest in the culture when I arrived there. It's a set of circumstances that at first forced me to stay and later on made me want to stay. But I think the main privilege I have, yes, is that I can leave. And that's the situation in many cases of locations where I find myself working. I'm always somewhat privileged because I can choose to leave. I can go to Afghanistan and choose to leave. I can go to any place, and that is a luxury nowadays. In a world that is becoming increasingly defined by identities of a nation and where borders are getting increasingly difficult to cross.
And that's the theme of my next question. Yeah, it's about borders.
Yeah. As I mentioned earlier, borders is something that I came across, I wouldn't say by chance, but as one of the many topics that interested me, and people seem to have associated a lot of my practice to borders, and hence invited me to a lot of borders around the world, a lot of borders going through some sort of situation of conflict. But borders, I think it's only since the late 19th century that people need a passport to go from one country to another. The concept of border is becoming more and more associated to obstacle and to confining more than to traveling. It's a change that is going, has particularly developed in the last, I would say, decade. It's become more and more present.
So it's a paradox because you can travel more and further, but it's more difficult, right?
Not only that, but also the economy became global, communication became global, and freedom of movement is increasingly confined. So there's a sort of anachronism in between the two phenomena. Next word?
Fabula. I love Fabula.
Fabula was a very unexpected encounter. I was actually only, the first Fabulas I found were only because I was recycling found paintings to paint my own images. And on the market in Brussels, I found two identical images which I decided to keep. A few weeks later, back in Mexico, I found yet another painting of the same woman, the profile of woman. And from there on, I started being intrigued by that particular image. I was myself already very much interested in the copying process. I had my own painting copied by signed painters, which I would then in turn copy myself, etc. So the copying process and the sort of minor art was something that I was already investigating when I found out about the Fabula painting, and I started systematically looking for them when I would travel in all sorts of different parts of the world. The collection grew mostly out of donations, friends finding them
really?
all over. Yeah, it became really a collective project. Nowadays I'm hardly looking for them anymore, but the collection keeps growing because people send me fabulas from different corners of the planet.
And you are showing it all over the world, right?
I've been touring it because I think it's an interesting phenomenon. That people call it a collection. I see it more like I'm exposing a phenomena, and I'm trying to also bring it to attention what is an icon, what is an art icon. Is it, this seems to be having a sort of iconic status within a public of more like amateur painters. For other people it will be the urinoir of Duchamp. So it's all relative. And I think it's also
And we forget the author anyway. Jean-Jacques Henner, I think, right?
Jean-Jacques Henner.
Everyone forgot him.
Yeah, no, but
Not everyone.
I think that's precisely what makes it an icon. It's not about the authorship anymore. It's about an image, and it's about how an image survived in this particular case through its copying process because the original was lost in the early 20th century.
Children.
Well, I talked a lot about children today. Children are both what inspire and the main sort of protagonist of my works in the last decade or so. So it's a sort of game of give and take. But I was for a long time the main protagonist of my videos. I think over time I sort of withdrew and gave the lead to the next generation, if you want, which are the children. And I'm very happy about that.
But what do we learn from children?
What do we learn? We're reminded of where the essential values of life should be. I mean, I think they have a much clearer understanding of what's right and wrong, of what is the sort of transparency in children that we tend to lose with in adulthood. And I think there's a sort of, not just spontaneity, there's a sort of honesty that is very, very much anchored in children, and that gets eroded over time.
And you remember your own childhood?
Yeah, very much.
Really?
Yeah, very
You are
much.
still with it in a way?
Yeah, I hope. Yeah, I am. Yeah, it's still a big part of my sort of fantasy, if you revisit that sort of space. It was a very happy and very peaceful childhood in Belgian countryside. So it's a sort of, there's no, it's a sort of continuum. There was no tension or any drama creating a fracture. So from age 5, when we moved to the countryside, to age 16 when I left, it's just one continuum of time, which makes it very peculiar. I can't place, if I think about my childhood, I remember clearly the activities and games we were doing, but I can't say if I was 9 or 12.
And you remember school and all that? It was not painful?
School was terrible.
Terrible, but you were happy? Lucky you.
I had a lot of freedom. I had enough of the freedom. And, we had to show up for dinner, and that was the only rule. I had a bicycle and later on a moped, and from 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock at night, as long as my grades were good enough, no questions asked. So it was a very simple contract with my parents, and a very good one. So they didn't interfere much with my activities, but they were allowing me to explore in all possible ways, whether I would or not show up at school. That was, as long as my grades were okay, everything was fine.
So of course, children's games.
Children's games, as I mentioned earlier, were something I came across by chance. I mean, I think they were it was a way of making footnotes to more fictionalized works. In the first children game, for example, the one of skipping stones or pebbles, like ricochet, it was the perfect metaphor when I saw those children on the Strait of Gibraltar doing ricochet with stones of this desire to reach the horizon. And I was myself working on a project with children creating the illusion of a bridge across the Strait of Gibraltar. Later on, they became the sort of entry point when I would start investigating a new project in some new location. I mean, it was a very easy way of creating a first contact with the locals and understanding the cultural codes when it comes down to filming. You know, people react very differently in different places of the world when you take a camera out of your bag. And children, filming children in particular, will instantly provoke a set of reactions of the people around. And you know, in some places they will ignore you. In some places they will put limits to what you can film. In some places they will shy away. In some, it changes.
So children's game for you is a metaphor in you.
It's both a metaphor and a sort of contextualization of. So in some cases, I think the children games are just a way of contextualizing a sort of social set in parallel to a fictionalized video. You know, so I would often have the sort of more fictionalized artwork in one room, and next to it a short video of a children game that is filmed pretty much in the same location, but where I don't interfere. So I put the two in relation. It's sort of a reminder, okay, this is the place, this is the way it works, and this is where how I intervened in that situation.
And how many children games have you done?
So far, like 20-something. 20-something, there's still a lot to be done.
Of course, all over the world, right?
Yeah.
Political changes.
Political changes. Political changes.
You are a witness of that now in your work.
More lately, and I think look, there's only so much I can say about that. What I can say is that rather than looking at those changes retrospectively, I'm trying to be present while they're happening. If you want, it's a little bit like rather than. I mean, if I think of many artist friends that work on the base of archives and the base of reworking events that may have happened 10, 15, 20 years earlier, I try to be there when they happen and document, looking for a different angle than a war journalist or a.
About what countries you think?
I don't know. The last years I've been in Iraq mostly. Been working in Iraq, so I've had all sorts of situations where it's, from direct combat to refugee camps to places that went through major destructions, and it's always it's always about trying to find the angle that is not necessarily it's about finding how those situations create a different set of rules and seem to be activating a very particular creativity of survival of.
So, for example, with children games in Iraq.
Children games, the best example is the one of in Mosul. I filmed the children that had been forbidden to play football during the Islamic State and had set up this whole sort of ritual of playing football without the ball.
This is so poetic, right?
Yeah. And so they were respecting all the ritual of the game, but there was no ball. But they would, mark score and penalties and corners and do the whole theater of football in the absence of a ball, and it didn't seem to be a limit to the game, if you want.
So when did you witness that?
In 2016, just during the offensive in Mosul. The west side was still being occupied by Islamic State. The eastern side had been liberated. The eastern side was liberated. We're talking about Tigris River. Tigris River divides the city in two entities. Western side was still occupied. Eastern side was freed like a few months earlier. So I was on the eastern side, of Mosul.
61 minutes.
61 minutes would be just about qualifying to make a feature film in festival.
And you have done one.
And I've done one. I'm presently completing one, which is my sort of, technically speaking, first feature film. It's a century of Iraqi history reenacted by the children of a small mountain village near Mosul. So it's a series of historical events interpreted by, or imagined, I could nearly say, by those children. You know, we discussed with them and sort of set up, okay, this is what happened. You do your own sort of interpretation and reenactment of that historical moment, and it goes across the whole of the 20th century up till the just aftermath of Islamic State in 2017. That's essentially.
And so when shall we see that?
You shall see that in Rotterdam in January.
Rotterdam, but it's far. Not from here, but in France, for example.
In France, we've applied at the it's called the Film de Marseille.
Oui.
Et le Cinéma du Réel.
Ah.
Je sais pas. On verra.
And in US, you think?
Sorry?
In US?
In US to Sundance, and I've also applied to the Tribeca Film Festival. You know, you do as many as you can, and you apply to all of them to eventually see which one will take you. It's a totally new field to me. I mean, I'm learning, so I'm learning the rules of the game along the way.
Last word. Your next dream.
My next dream, I think, is not so ambitious. Is to hopefully have enough time to not complete, but extend the children game series. I think it's a project I started as a sort of side project, which I think is sort of developing in a more interesting way than I expected. And I think I would like to dedicate at least the next 3 years maybe to more systematically look for them. And there's a whole continent where I've not even started, which is Africa.
Of course, I was thinking about it. And people and kids are still in the street, right?
Yeah, I mean, so that's one place where I would like to investigate. You know, I may come across the same games as some of the ones I filmed in other locations. I mean, there's always some sort of variations. But yeah, I think it's worthwhile dedicating a real period of my life to completing. You know, it's others can complete it later. You know, it will always evolve, and there will always be some sort of more local games that can be documented, which I won't be aware of. But the archetypal games like Leapfrog, Saute Mouton.
Ah oui.
I've not filmed it yet, you know, and I should film it, etc.
Un trap-trap.
Trap-trap?
Quand on court après.
Oui. Somebody told me that yesterday here. Quand tu espèce de loup et mouton.
Jouer au loup.
Ouais.
Merci beaucoup.